Hi and welcome to Gender. We're going to look in this chapter at gendered verbal communication. Now this chapter will dovetail nicely with the next chapter, which we'll be looking at nonverbal communication. So looking at either example. Now you're going to see, I'm going to put them just sort of around me here, are three sentences that you'll find in your textbook. Now listen to this carefully. The woman judge casts the deciding vote. Now in this instance, the sentence highlights that she, woman, and judge. So we have to, in this case, we've highlighted her sex, and it suggests that it's odd or in some way unusual for a judge to be a woman. Otherwise, we would just say the judge cast the deciding vote. But to put woman in front of judge, it's what's known as highlighting. Sort of suggesting that the language is suggesting that the reader won't know that the judge was a woman, or that somehow they should know because it's odd and unusual. A second sentence, Jason babysat his son while his wife was attending a meeting. Now that's one that I've seen happen a lot. I'm a dad. I don't babysit my daughter. I have parented her. So why don't we refer to a father caring for their children as parenting? When we don't say that mothers babysit their children. And so the notion that Jason is babysitting is to suggest he's not taking a primary role in the parenting, that it's a woman's responsibility, when in fact Jason isn't babysitting, Jason is parenting. I used to be, as a behavior consultant, do workshops on parenting. And out of 30 people in the class, there would be 28 women and 2 men. Most of the guys were at home babysitting their children, as their wives would say. So it is interesting how we will use language to sort of show the differences between men and women. Thirdly, freshmen find it difficult to adjust to college life. Well, just the use of the word freshmen, men. At the first year, the question then gets begged is, are all first-year students males? Well, of course not. And yet the language often incorporates men where it's universally accepted to mean everybody, but does it? So this is what this chapter is going to be about, and the next will be also, in terms of its nonverbal communication, the close relationship between communication and gender. Remember to use your textbook for further explanations and examples. So let's get started. Language is one of our most complex symbol systems. We learn language over a large period of time, and we refine our ability to use language throughout our life. Symbols allow us to define, organize, and evaluate phenomenon, thinking hypothetically, and self-reflection. Symbols, language, define phenomena. Therefore, language defines gender as well. Language reflects and reinforces cultural views and values. It's how we communicate to one another much about our lives and what goes on in the world. Verbal communication expresses cultural views of gender, and we're going to look at 6 connections between language and gender. The first, male generic language excludes. Now what we mean by that is male generic language, words like chairman, mailman, mankind, he, these claim to include both sexes, yet research studies have shown people associate males only with generic terms with much greater frequency than they associate females with them. That when you hear the term policeman, mailman, postman, you have an image immediately of a man, not of a woman. Not to say that you won't, after a while of talking, acknowledge that that exists, but in the way we use the language, how language has been used throughout my life and probably yours and my parents' life, is that when those terms get used and you get an immediate image in your mind, it's not likely of either a male or a female, it's likely just male. Because of the evidence provided by these studies, most dictionary and newspaper writing style manuals have policies requiring inclusive language and warn against using male generic language. Some universities and the Washington Post will now use only as they refer to individuals. And we start seeing that happening more and more. Your textbook, the author makes a very solid effort to try to be more gender neutral when it comes to using language in the textbook. Number 2, language defines gender as binary. Now, what do we mean then? Women are more frequently defined by appearance and by relationships with others, while men are more often defined by activities, accomplishments, and positions. So in terms of when we say binary, we're meaning that we're putting it on a continuum, that there are language defines gender for men and for women, and they are not the same. So it suggests we're all different, and we are, but language is binary is the point. Language, this is 3, this is included in 2. Language reflects social views of women as passive and men as active. For instance, phrases to suggest sexual activity imply that men are active and women are passive. Now, because of the nature of video, I'm not going to include the phrases that are in your textbook. You can read them to sort of see what that point and how that actualizes in the way we use our language. Now, language reflects also a social view of women as defined by their relationship with others instead of independent agents. This comes out a lot when you look at and I've forgotten the term, and it'll come up later in the semester. I think it's called the Bushell scale. It looks at the role of women in movies and how to determine whether that movie represents women in a very similar way to men, or do they treat men and women differently? And part of it is based on this sort of women are only in movies to be related to or in some way connected with men, but not as independent. No man directs what this woman will or will not feel or think. And so it's just an interesting that language reflects the social view of women. And they don't typically see them as a standalone independent agent. They see them connected. So for example, women who don't marry are often referred to in a negative term. Spinsters. Women are traditionally expected to take the husband's last name when they get married. Now, we are seeing more alternatives to that, including there are the examples where there's hyphenation, creating a new name between the husband and the wife, or a matriarchal rule of mothers, where there are some examples where men are taking the woman's last name. Now, some people choose to rename themselves based on that matriarchal lineage, but for the most part, generally, it's not that way. Women change their last name. 3, language shapes awareness of gender issues. Language shapes awareness of gender issues. Language shapes awareness of what is important and helps us define realities. When something is named, for example, sexual harassment, date rape, it's easier to recognize it, think about it, and stop it. When it first emerged, this whole issue around stalking, women who were stalked by either former partners or strangers to them but were being stalked, it wasn't a criminal issue. It wasn't described in our language. It wasn't something that as a society we took to understand in a very real way. But when stalking became defined, it had been a part of the language, it became a criminal activity, and it became something that was able to be worked towards stopping. Language is always changing, and we shift our use of words to help create realities that are important to us. People shape language, and language shapes people and culture. 4, language organizes perceptions of gender. A stereotype is a generalization. You look at one example of a person, and you take characteristics of that person and apply it to all people with those same characteristics. That could be skin color, that could be religion, that could be because they wear glasses, but you treat everybody that way. That's stereotyping. Stereotype is a generalization about a group based on an often limited population or number. Information about some people who are part of that group. Now, stereotypes overlook individual characteristics and differences. You can no more say that all Canadians are the same as you can say all Americans are the same, all people from Africa are the same. We're not. There is individual characteristics that separate everybody, and it's not black and white. Women are often stereotyped as overly emotional and weak, while men tend to be stereotyped as rational and strong. Now, those things got in the way of women who were ambitious, and men who saw the value of nurturing. They didn't fit, and there wasn't language for that. Polarized thinking is looking at things as complete and distinct opposites. Men, women, good, bad, active, inactive. There's more room for differences along that continuum. For instance, assuming something is either right or wrong, or a person is male or female, or masculine and feminine, there's no area in between. This is polarized thinking. And of course we know there is more difference between men and women, just not men and women. And masculine and feminine, there's all sorts of area in between. The English language encourages polarized thinking by having very few words that indicate the fine levels of distinction. In our Canadian lexicon language, we might say there's snow, and we might even, if you're a skier, know there's corn snow, powder snow. But in cultures where snow is a bigger part of their life than ours, they have many more words for snow. So they have a range to cover that distinction of variation, where in other cultures they only have it's either snow or not snow. Queer performative theory challenges polarized language for sex, gender, and sexual orientation, in that they've always been strong supporters of a more fluid gender, so that's why they would be challenging this polarization. 5. Language evaluates gender. Language reflects cultural values and is a powerful influence in our perceptions. Women are referred to as immature or juvenile with terms like girl, baby, doll, as nicknames, if you will. They're juvenile, they're immature, and yet they apply to grown up women. Or equate with food, sweet thing, sugar, or animals, chick, bitch. These are the evaluative qualities of how our language differentiates male and female. Diminutive suffixes designate women as reduced forms of male standard. For example, a majorette, bachelorette. These are reduced forms of what a particular status for man is. Women are often blamed with language. I'm going to apologize for saying it because I know I can't be with you to make sure we understand the same. But the example in your textbook, women are often blamed with language, the example being slut, for the same behavior that when men do it, it's celebrated in language for doing the same thing, where we might say stud. And so we treat men and women quite differently with language, and we don't think about it. We just come to understand that's the way it is. And that's the whole point about language and gender, is we don't think about and evaluate what we say and how we say it and what it means and how that message gets communicated and what that means. Female and feminine terms are used to degrade boys and men. You use feminine terms for men like sissy and mama's boy. Again, they are evaluative. They give an evaluation of something that this guy did that made others go, well, that's just sissy, or you're just being a mama's boy. It evaluates men who are different from the other men. 6. Language allows self-reflection. Now, self-reflection is a bigger topic than what we're going to talk about here, but as it applies here, Because we use symbols to communicate language, it shapes how we think of ourselves, in addition to how we see the world around us. Meanings of language change over time. So, for example, what is considered fat now may have been considered slim several decades ago. And so the meaning can change over time. I can remember when bad was bad, and then I remember when bad turned to be good. I'm not sure what bad is now. Michael Jackson bad. So how we use words change over time. If the existing language is inadequate, we can move beyond it, such as through labeling ourselves as androgynous, gender queer, or gender non-conforming. This nudges the culture to recognize us for our own terms. And we see this starting to happen, and not just starting, it continually shapes our language over time as to what words mean and how we can add more recognition for the differences with new language. Gender styles of verbal communication. Males tend to be socialized in masculine ways. Females tend to be socialized in feminine ways. And this is not always the case. And it's important to remember that some people do not define themselves as male or female, masculine or feminine. Gendered styles of communication means that girls can learn masculine modes of communicating and boys can learn feminine modes. Some people work towards becoming fluent in both modes of communication. However, there are some general statements that we can make about feminine and masculine gendered communities or communication. Let's look at them individually. Gendered speech and communities. A speech community is a group of people who have a common understanding of the communication goals and how each of those goals and interpretation of communication. Males and females tend to be socialized into masculine and feminine speech communities through games. These gendered speech communities share communication practices and often underlie common misinterpretations between members of different speech communities. 2. Lessons of children's play. Researchers have drawn connections between the ways children play and the way they communicate. This pattern seems to develop since children tend to play in sex-segregated groups and play different types of games based on those groups. Boys' games are often played in large groups, are competitive, and have clear goals, include roughhousing, and have distinct rules and roles. Structured by goals and roles, there is a limited need to discuss how to play. Boys' games cultivate 4 communication rules. 1. Use communication to assert ideas, opinions, and identity. 2. Use communication to achieve a specific goal. 3. Use communication to attract and maintain others' attentions. And 4. Use communication to compete for attention with others. Now keep that in mind, because now we're going to look at girls' games are often played in smaller groups or even in pairs and often do not have clear rules or roles. Players must talk to work out the rules, and talking is a key part of playing. For instance, girls often play house or school, and they emphasize 4 aspects of communication that cultivates interpersonal relationships. 1. Use communication to create and sustain relationships. 2. Use communication to establish egalitarian relations. Now remember, patriarchal, men govern or rule. Matriarchal, females govern or rule. Egalitarian is balanced. This is 3, the use communication to include others, and use communication to show sensitivity to others in relationships. The size of girls' groups foster pro-social, cooperative play, while boys' groups encourage competition. Many girls today play competitive sports and learn the rules of masculine speech communities. This is consistent with standpoint theory's premise that subordinate groups are motivated to learn the standpoint of dominant groups. And you see this if you ever watch any of the women's Olympic hockey or national hockey and you hear them being interviewed. It's interesting to hear how some language carries over from the men's game to the women's game, and that's women getting familiar with a masculine community, speech community. And it can happen the other way as well. 3. Gender communication practices. Feminine speech communities view communication as a tool for establishing and sustaining interpersonal relationships. Communication in feminine speech communities, they foster communication in relationships. They equalize the status and establish equality. They show support for one another using empathy, and does conventional maintenance work. That is, they sort of check in with one another and how are we doing. They invite others to be part of the conversation. They demonstrate responsiveness by giving nods and feedback in dialogue. Share personal information with details, personal disclosures, and concrete details regarding. They will share information. It's often tentative, using verbal hedges and tag questions. Tentative just means that sometimes there's a non-verbal or added verbal, hedging or tag questions. You'll find that in your textbook as well. Now, some controversy surrounds this. Robin Lakoff's argument that hedges make women's speech powerless by indicating a lack of confidence. That is to say, if you're not using the words to express yourself, but you're hedging, then it's that's saying you're taking the power from your speech. However, Lakoff's argument relies on using masculine speech as the standard, as if that's the primary way. And if we are looking at this more egalitarianly, we wouldn't use masculine speech as the standard to compare to feminine speech. Masculine speech communities view communication as a way of establishing goals, exert control, preserve independence, entertain, and enhance status. Communication in the masculine speech communities, they establish status and control, and this is done through asserting ideas and authority, disclosing less than women. They might talk over each other and interrupt in order to get that part across. It's used to accomplish instrumental objectives, the use of face-to-face or computer-mediated communication to accomplish instrumental objectives. Men want to show that their knowledge to others and to solve problems. Men speech communities gain and maintain conversational command. Interruption is one characteristic of this. While both genders, both male and female, interrupt, masculine communicators tend to do so more frequently. Masculine and feminine communicators also differ in their reasons for interpreting. Masculine communicators interrupt to take control of the conversation, while feminine communicators interrupt to indicate interest and respond to others. Masculine speech communities is direct and assertive, and is often abstract rather than personal. Can create barriers to intimacy, this abstractness, because it isn't personal, and that's something that is much more a part of the male masculine speech community. Includes a minimal of response cues. These are the small verbal cues, that show that you're paying attention. They may do less than women, and it's less emotionally responsive. So, when we look at the gender-linked language effect, the gender-linked language effect notes that language differences between men and women is affected by a number of factors, and it can include whatever the topic is, the speaker's status, the conversational partners, and the significance of gender to the conversation. Now, women tend to speak more tentatively on masculine topics, but men speak more tentatively than women on female topics, which should make sense, I guess. Gender expression varies according to the context and factors and other factors. So if we're looking at gender-based misinterpretations in communication, we can look at a number of points. One, showing support. People who are feminine communicators often want to talk about the problem, while masculine communicators want to solve it. And so this is where some of the sources of misunderstandings between men and women come into play. Women want to continue to talk about the issue to come to a better understanding so we can resolve and come to an egalitarian result, where men just want to listen for the purposes of expressing how we can solve it. And that's what we if you self-reflect on some of your relationship issues, you might find this one interfering at times. This often leaves both communicators feeling unsupported. Showing sympathy can be interpreted as condescending by masculine communicators, but is seen as a way of showing support in feminine communicators. 2, the trouble talk. Now that's sort of trouble talk. This is masculine communicators tend to show respect by assuming others don't need sympathy. But in feminine speech communities, this seems to dismiss someone's feelings if you don't show, and I think maybe empathy more than sympathy. By asking what's wrong in a masculine speech community, you're imposing and pushing to expose vulnerabilities, but not disclosing someone from a feminine speech community could feel like they're being shut out. And so if you've been in groups of men, the idea of talking about your relationship in a meaningful and emotional component is not common. I remember being at a baseball game with my buds, and we were in the friend's garage after the game drinking some beers, and it was some 25 years ago, and I was going through a divorce, and I was worried about my daughter, and I brought it up. Why, I don't know, but I did. And there was an immediate quiet that sort of came over, and it's almost like I breached the masculine speech community by saying, "What are you doing bringing that stuff up? That doesn't fit. We're talking about sports. We're trying to control and have, the dialogue be about things that we can manage and control. You're bringing up stuff that we don't have the language for." It was interesting. Feminine speech communities relate by matching experiences, but in a male speech community, this could feel like an attempt to steal attention or focus on the conversation elsewhere. Thirdly, in terms of misunderstandings, the point of the story. Masculine communicators tend to tell a story in a linear, chronological way, while feminine communicators tend to tell stories that are less structured and maybe have stops along the way. Masculine communicators often feel that feminine communicators fail to move quickly to the point of the story, and feminine communicators often feel that masculine communicators don't include important relationship level details. And so there we go. Differences in how men and women communicate, which may in fact be something that we notice in our relationships that interfere. And we haven't figured out how to find that sort of common ground or level of trust by which the vulnerabilities and being in each other's communication group can work. Masculine communicators tend to talk about a relationship only when there's a problem, and feminine communicators tend to want to check in more regularly about the state of the relationship. Masculine speech communication views communication as a means of doing things and solving problems, whereas feminine speech communities regard the process of communication as the primary way to create and sustain a relationship. Public speaking, number 5. A masculine speaking style is generally the standard for public speaking. Women in politics have to manage a fine balance in which they are sufficiently female and sufficiently masculine. Now, when couples, understand how to interpret each other's rules, how men understand the female speech communities and how females understand the male speech communities, they're less likely to misread motives. Greater fluidity and influence in gender communicative norms can empower us to become more gratifying conversational partners, and no doubt have a greater impact on our future in regards to the different groups that we're going to be a part of and to be an effective communicator. Now, this has been an overview of Chapter 5, Gendered Verbal Communication. Next week, we're going to go into an overview on Chapter 6, Gendered Nonverbal Communication. All right, everybody. Keep up the good work, and we'll see you next week.